What red flag did everyone ignore until it was too late? You need to stop questioning everything and just be grateful. My therapist's words hit me like ice water as I sat in her office trying to explain why Alex's perfect timing felt wrong. She leaned back in her leather chair and suggested I was self-sabotaging because I couldn't accept that someone actually cared about me. According to Dr. Reeves, my discomfort with Alex's attentiveness was trauma response from my previous relationship with an emotionally unavailable man who barely remembered my birthday. She pulled out her notes from our previous sessions and pointed to patterns of self-doubt and fear of intimacy that she claimed were driving my suspicions. Alex had this way of materializing whenever crisis struck. When my tire went flat on Highway 92 during rush hour, he appeared behind me with hazard lights flashing before I'd even finished pulling over. He jumped out with a jack and spare tire, grinning like he'd been driving that exact route hoping to find me stranded. I was so grateful for the rescue that I didn't question how he'd known I needed help. The flat tire happened on a Wednesday afternoon when I decided to take a different route home from work to avoid construction. I'd never driven that stretch of highway before, yet Alex found me within minutes of my breakdown. He claimed he'd been running errands in the area and spotted my car, but the timing felt impossibly convenient. Alex worked downtown, 15 miles in the opposite direction from Highway 92. When I mentioned this inconsistency, he laughed and said he'd been visiting a client in that area and was lucky to be nearby when I needed help. My sister Natalie rolled her eyes whenever I expressed discomfort about his uncanny timing. She'd divorced her husband the year before after discovering his gambling addiction and constantly reminded me that good men were rare. When I mentioned Alex's surprise appearances felt overwhelming rather than romantic, she'd shake her head and say I was looking for problems where none existed. "You're doing that thing again where you push away anyone who actually treats you well," Natalie would say, sipping her coffee while scrolling through dating apps. She'd show me profiles of men who couldn't string together coherent sentences and remind me that Alex brought me flowers every Friday and remembered my coffee order. According to Natalie, I should be grateful instead of suspicious, especially after my track record with emotionally distant partners. She'd recount stories of her own failed relationships and point out how Alex's behavior was everything women claim to want in a boyfriend. Her constant reminders made me feel ungrateful for questioning what everyone else saw as perfection. The pattern escalated after we'd been together for 6 months. I came down with a stomach bug on a Sunday morning and spent the day curled up on my couch, too sick to check my phone. By evening, Alex was at my door with homemade chicken soup, explaining he'd gotten worried when I didn't respond to his messages. He'd brought a thermometer, medicine, and even fresh pajamas in my exact size. The gesture was so thoughtful that I pushed down my questions about how he'd known I was sick when I hadn't told anyone. Alex explained that he'd had a feeling something was wrong when I didn't send my usual good morning text. He said he'd tried calling twice, but my phone went straight to voicemail, so he'd driven over to check on me. The concern in his eyes looked genuine, and I felt guilty for questioning his motives. When I asked how he'd known to bring pajamas, he said he'd noticed mine were old and thought I might want something comfortable while recovering. My coworker Diana watched me reheat Alex's soup in the office microwave Monday morning and listened to the story with growing enthusiasm. She'd been single for 3 years and lived vicariously through my relationship updates. Diana worked in accounting and spent her lunch breaks reading romance novels where men anticipated their partner's every need. When I mentioned feeling suffocated by his constant attention, Diana laughed and said I was sabotaging my own happiness. "Do you know how many women would kill for a boyfriend who actually pays attention?" Diana asked, stirring sugar into her coffee. She reminded me that most women complained about boyfriends who were inattentive and distant. Her reaction made me feel ungrateful and confused about my own instincts. Diana would spend the next hour describing her latest dating disasters and comparing them to my perfect relationship with Alex. Every story reinforced how lucky I was to have found someone who cared enough to anticipate my needs. The incidents continued with increasing frequency and precision. When my car wouldn't start one morning, Alex appeared in the parking garage with jumper cables before I'd called anyone for help. He claimed he'd been leaving early for a meeting and heard my engine struggling to turn over from 3 floors up in the concrete structure. When I got locked out of my apartment after a night out, he showed up with my spare key, claiming he'd been in the neighborhood and seen my frantic texts to my landlord. The timing was perfect, arriving just as I was considering calling a locksmith. Alex had saved me both money and embarrassment, but something about his immediate availability felt orchestrated. When I twisted my ankle jogging, Alex materialized with ice packs and bandages as if he'd been following my running route. He said he'd been driving to the gym and noticed me limping on the sidewalk. The explanation was plausible, but the ice packs were already frozen and the bandages were the exact type I preferred for sports injuries. Each rescue came with a perfectly reasonable explanation that I couldn't argue against. Alex worked in tech consulting and traveled frequently for clients, which meant he could plausibly be anywhere at any time. His schedule was flexible and his routes unpredictable, making it believable that he'd simply happened upon me during moments of crisis. The explanations were always logical, but the frequency felt impossible. In 6 months, Alex had appeared during 7 different emergencies, each time with exactly the right supplies and exactly the right explanation. When I tried to calculate the odds of such coincidences, the numbers didn't make sense. My mother loved Alex immediately and couldn't understand my reservations about his attentiveness. During family dinners, she'd gush about how thoughtful he was and tell stories about my father's romantic gestures when they were dating. Mom would pull out old photo albums and show Alex pictures of their courtship, bonding over shared values about protecting and caring for loved ones. "Your generation doesn't understand what real devotion looks like," Mom would say, refilling Alex's wine glass. She'd grown up in an era where men were expected to be providers and protectors, and Alex's behavior aligned perfectly with her ideals of masculine care. When I tried to explain that his attention felt invasive, she'd dismiss my concerns as modern feminist nonsense. My father was quieter in his approval, but equally supportive of Alex's behavior. Dad had always been the type to fix problems before they became crises, and he appreciated Alex's proactive approach to caring for me. During one dinner, Dad pulled Alex aside to thank him for taking such good care of me and expressed relief that I'd found someone reliable. Even my closest friends at work began commenting on how lucky I was to have Alex. When I'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed by his attention, they'd point out that their own boyfriends barely remembered anniversary dates. My complaints about his perfect timing were met with jokes about first-world problems and suggestions that I was overthinking a good thing. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine girls' night at my apartment. Natalie and Diana had come over with wine and takeout for our monthly catch-up session. We were deep in conversation about Diana's latest dating app disasters when her phone died mid-sentence while she was showing us a particularly awful profile. She grabbed my phone from the coffee table to finish the story, and I watched her expression change from amusement to confusion as she scrolled through my home screen. Her finger paused over an icon I'd never noticed before, a small green circle with a white location pin. The app was called Family 360 and sat between my banking app and photo gallery. Diana tapped it without asking permission, and the app opened immediately to a detailed map of our city. A bright blue dot pulsed at my exact address, showing my location in real time. The timestamp indicated my position had updated just minutes before, and a history tab revealed everywhere I'd been that entire day. My morning coffee run at 8:15 a.m., my grocery store trip at 11:30 a.m., and my stop at the dry cleaner at 2:45 p.m. were all marked with precise GPS coordinates and duration stamps. Natalie leaned over to see the screen and her wine glass froze halfway to her lips. The app showed not just locations but detailed analytics about my movements. Diana scrolled through weeks of data with growing horror, watching my life reduced to a series of dots on a digital map. The app had detailed information about my speed while driving, how long I'd spent at each location, and even notifications about when I'd arrived home each evening. There were settings I'd never configured and sharing permissions I'd never granted. "This is seriously messed up," Diana whispered, her face pale as she continued scrolling. The tracking history went back 4 months, creating a comprehensive record of my daily movements. Every appointment, every errand, every social outing had been documented and stored in this database I'd never authorized. Most disturbing was a second user account linked to the tracking data, someone who'd been monitoring every move I made. My hands were shaking as I took the phone back and tried to understand what I was seeing. The user profile showed Alex's name and phone number with administrator privileges over my location data. Natalie grabbed the device and started digging deeper into the app's settings. She found contact lists, notification preferences, and sharing permissions that had been configured without my knowledge. The app was sending Alex real-time updates about where I was going, and how long I stayed anywhere. Every surprise appearance, every perfect timing, every miraculous rescue had been orchestrated. "He's been stalking you," Natalie said, her voice flat with disbelief. The flat tire, the food poisoning, the dead battery at work, all of it suddenly felt calculated and sinister, rather than coincidental. Diana started pacing around my living room, her face flushed with anger as she connected the dots we'd all missed. Alex's uncanny ability to show up during emergencies wasn't intuition or devotion. It was premeditated stalking disguised as romance. He'd been tracking my movements and manipulating situations to position himself as my rescuer and protector. The perfect boyfriend had been a predator the entire time, and everyone had helped him normalize his behavior. The three of us sat in stunned silence as the full scope of the violation became clear. Alex had turned my phone into a tracking device and convinced everyone, including me, that his intrusive behavior was proof of his love. He'd weaponized my gratitude and used my friend's desire to see me happy as cover for systematic surveillance. Every person who'd told me to appreciate his attentiveness had been unknowingly enabling a stalker to monitor my every movement. The therapist who'd called me self-sabotaging, the sister who'd called me ungrateful, the friends who'd called me paranoid, they'd all been manipulated into supporting his abuse. Alex had created a perfect system where his victims defended his behavior. "We need to document everything before confronting him," Diana said, her experience in corporate investigations kicking into gear. She took screenshots of the tracking history, the app settings, and the shared user permissions, while I tried to remember when Alex might have had access to install the software. The realization hit me like a physical blow when I remembered him borrowing my phone 3 weeks into our relationship. Alex had claimed his battery died and he needed to call his mother about a family emergency. He'd disappeared into my bathroom for 15 minutes and returned with apologies about his mom being chatty and worried about his father's health. I'd been sympathetic and hadn't thought twice about lending him my phone. Now I realized those 15 minutes had been spent installing surveillance software and configuring tracking permissions. Alex had used a fabricated family crisis to gain access to my device and turn it into a monitoring system. We decided to set a trap to prove Alex was using the tracking data actively, rather than just passively collecting it. Diana suggested I drive to a location I'd never visited before while leaving my phone at home, then have Natalie text Alex about a fabricated emergency requiring his help. If he showed up at my apartment instead of searching for me elsewhere, we'd know he was actively monitoring the tracking data in real time. The plan felt risky but necessary to understand the full extent of his surveillance. We needed concrete proof that couldn't be explained away by coincidence or intuition. I drove to a 24-hour diner across town while Natalie stayed at my apartment with my phone. The diner was in a part of the city I'd never explored, at least 30 minutes from anywhere Alex might expect to find me. Diana followed in her own car to serve as a witness and document Alex's response to our test. We synchronized our watches and agreed on the exact timing of Natalie's emergency text. At exactly 9 p.m., Natalie sent Alex a message from her number claiming I'd called her crying about a panic attack and asking if he could check on me. The text was carefully crafted to sound urgent but vague, giving Alex room to interpret the situation. Within 12 minutes, Alex was knocking on my apartment door with concerned questions about my mental state and offers to drive me to the emergency room. Meanwhile, I was sitting in the diner parking lot, watching the timestamp on Family 360 through screenshots Diana had sent to my email. The app showed my phone location as stationary at my apartment. His immediate response to Natalie's text and his arrival at my building confirmed he was actively monitoring my movements and using that data to maintain his facade of being caring and attentive. Diana called me from her car parked outside my apartment building, describing Alex's frantic behavior as he waited for me to return from my supposed walk. He paced the hallway for 20 minutes, calling my phone repeatedly and growing increasingly agitated when I didn't answer. When other residents complained about the noise, Alex claimed he was worried about his girlfriend's mental health emergency and needed to stay until I returned safely. His performance was convincing, but we now knew it was based on surveillance data. The confrontation happened the next evening when I returned home to find Alex waiting in my apartment with dinner from my favorite restaurant. He'd used the key I'd given him 2 months earlier and made himself comfortable on my couch, confident in his role as the perfect boyfriend who anticipated my needs. Candles were lit on the dining table, and he'd arranged the takeout containers like a romantic dinner he'd personally prepared. The scene was picture perfect, designed to reinforce his image as the thoughtful partner everyone believed him to be. I sat across from him at my own dining table and asked directly if he'd installed any apps on my phone. Alex's immediate defensive response and refusal to make eye contact told me everything I needed to know. He deflected the question by asking why I was suddenly paranoid and suspicious, claiming my behavior had been erratic lately, and he was concerned about my mental state. The gaslighting was immediate and automatic. Alex's mask slipped completely when I showed him the Family 360 screenshots. His expressions shifted from confusion to panic to rage in the span of 30 seconds. He accused me of violating his privacy by looking through the app data, then claimed he'd only installed it to keep me safe in a dangerous world. When I pointed out that safety required consent, he exploded into a tirade about ungrateful women who couldn't appreciate men who actually cared about their well-being. "You live alone in a city full of criminals and psychos, and I'm the bad guy for trying to protect you," Alex shouted, his face red with indignation. He stood up from the table and began pacing my living room, gesturing wildly as he defended his actions. According to his twisted logic, monitoring my activities and manipulating circumstances to insert himself into my life was an act of protection rather than violation. He'd convinced himself that his deception was noble. The truth poured out of him like poison from a wound. He'd been reading my texts through a keylogger app, monitoring my email through forwarded copies, and following my social media activity through multiple fake accounts he'd created. The tracking app was just one component of a comprehensive surveillance system he'd built to monitor every aspect of my digital and physical life. He knew my work schedule better than I did, could predict my weekend plans before I made them, and had been orchestrating our entire relationship based on data he'd stolen from me. Alex's justification for the surveillance was more chilling than the surveillance itself. He explained that modern women couldn't be trusted to make good decisions about their own safety and relationships. He'd convinced himself that his deception was noble, and that my gratitude proved I needed his intervention, even if I was too naive to understand it. In his mind, I was incapable of protecting myself and required his constant monitoring to stay safe. "You should be thanking me instead of attacking me," Alex said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. He described incidents where his tracking had allegedly prevented me from harm, situations I didn't remember or hadn't considered dangerous. A late-night walk through my neighborhood that he'd interrupted with a surprise visit. A coworker's party I'd left early after receiving his concerned text about the host's reputation. Each intervention had felt organic at the time, but now revealed itself as manipulation. The full scope of his manipulation became clear when he revealed how he'd been orchestrating the emergencies I'd needed rescue from. The flat tire had been caused by a nail he'd placed strategically in my parking garage after tracking my usual arrival time at work. The food poisoning had come from contaminated leftovers he'd brought me, claiming they were from his favorite restaurant. The dead phone battery at work had resulted from a drainage app he'd installed remotely during one of his surprise lunch visits. Each crisis had been manufactured to create opportunities for him to play hero while deepening my dependence on his help. Alex had studied my routines through the tracking app and identified vulnerabilities he could exploit. He knew when I'd be alone and isolated, when I'd be most grateful for assistance, and when I'd be too overwhelmed to question his convenient appearances. "Everything I did was for us," Alex insisted, his tone shifting between anger and desperation. He described our relationship as a project he'd been perfecting, using data and manipulation to create the ideal romantic partnership. In his twisted worldview, my happiness and safety justified any violation of my privacy and autonomy. He'd convinced himself that love required total surveillance and control. Alex's rage intensified when he realized I wasn't going to thank him for his elaborate deception or apologize for discovering it. He called me paranoid and accused me of ruining the best relationship I'd ever had over stupid privacy concerns that didn't matter between people who loved each other. His definition of love apparently included complete surveillance and manufactured crises. I recorded the entire confrontation on my phone, hidden in my pocket with the voice memo app running. Alex's confession provided detailed evidence of his stalking behavior, his methods of surveillance, and his manufactured emergencies. He described his actions with pride, genuinely believing he'd been the perfect boyfriend rather than a dangerous predator. The recording would become crucial evidence in the legal proceedings that followed. The legal implications became clear when I contacted a domestic violence advocate the next morning. Alex's behavior constituted stalking under state law, regardless of our relationship status or his claimed motivations. The tracking app, keylogger software, and manufactured emergencies created a pattern of harassment and intimidation that qualified for a restraining order. The advocate, Maria Gonzalez, helped me document everything, and connected me with a lawyer who specialized in technology-facilitated abuse cases. She explained that cases like mine were becoming increasingly common as technology made surveillance easier. Detective Sarah Martinez with the Cybercrimes Unit took my statement and began investigating the full scope of Alex's surveillance operation. She explained that tech-savvy stalkers like Alex were becoming increasingly common, using sophisticated software to monitor and manipulate their victims. The Family 360 app was just the tip of the iceberg. Forensic analysis of my devices revealed multiple pieces of spyware and monitoring software Alex had installed over the course of our relationship. There were keyloggers capturing every password I typed, screen recording software documenting my browsing history, and email forwarding rules sending copies of my messages to accounts he controlled. The sophistication of the surveillance system was staggering. Alex had access to my banking information, work emails, private conversations with friends, and even my therapy session notes that I'd typed into a mental health app. He'd been living inside my digital life while maintaining the facade of being a caring boyfriend in my physical life. The police investigation revealed Alex had been perfecting his surveillance techniques on previous girlfriends. There were at least 3 other women who'd experienced his perfect timing and manufactured emergencies, but none had discovered the tracking software before relationships ended naturally. Detective Martinez showed me social media posts from Alex's ex-girlfriends describing eerily similar patterns of behavior they'd attributed to coincidence and caring, rather than systematic stalking. One woman described her ex-boyfriend's uncanny ability to show up with ice cream whenever she was sad. Another mentioned a former partner who always appeared with exactly what she needed during emergencies. The patterns were identical across multiple relationships, suggesting Alex had been refining his methods for years. One former girlfriend, Rachel, agreed to meet with me after Detective Martinez contacted her about the investigation. Rachel described a 6-month relationship with Alex that followed the exact same pattern as mine: uncanny timing, manufactured emergencies, and constant surveillance disguised as devotion. She'd broken up with Alex because his attentiveness felt suffocating, but she'd never suspected the tracking and manipulation. Like me, she'd been gaslit by friends and family who insisted she was ungrateful for having such a caring boyfriend. Rachel had spent months after their breakup wondering if she'd made a mistake leaving someone so devoted. The forensic analysis of Alex's computer revealed the true extent of his operation. He'd maintained detailed files on each of his projects, documenting personality profiles, schedules, vulnerabilities, and optimal manipulation strategies. My file contained hundreds of photos taken without my knowledge, transcripts of conversations he'd recorded, and psychological assessments he'd written about my behavior. Alex had treated his relationships like experiments, using data and manipulation to achieve desired outcomes. He'd documented which types of emergencies generated the most gratitude, which gifts created the strongest emotional responses, and which manipulations were most effective at creating dependency. The level of calculation and premeditation was staggering. Every aspect of our relationship had been orchestrated based on data he'd collected about my preferences and vulnerabilities. He'd noted that I responded well to acts of service but became suspicious of expensive gifts. He'd documented that I was most grateful for help during health crises, and most likely to overlook red flags when I felt protected. The restraining order hearing lasted 4 hours as Alex's lawyer tried to argue that tracking a girlfriend's location was normal behavior in modern relationships. Judge Harrison shut down this defense by pointing out that installing surveillance software without consent was illegal, regardless of relationship status. The evidence of manufactured emergencies and comprehensive digital monitoring painted a clear picture of predatory behavior designed to create artificial dependence and control. Alex's behavior during the hearing revealed his complete lack of remorse or understanding of his crimes. He interrupted the proceedings multiple times to defend his actions. When the judge warned him about courtroom decorum, Alex accused the legal system of criminalizing love and devotion. His outbursts only strengthened the case against him. The investigation expanded when other victims came forward after news of Alex's arrest spread through social media and local news coverage. Women from 3 different states contacted police with similar stories of boyfriends who'd had uncanny timing and manufactured emergencies. Detective Martinez coordinated with law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions to build a comprehensive case against Alex's stalking operation. The scope of his crimes was far larger than anyone had initially suspected. Federal authorities became involved when they discovered Alex had been selling personal data collected from his victims to identity theft rings. The surveillance operation wasn't just about control and manipulation, it was also generating income through the sale of private information. Banking details, social security numbers, and personal habits were all being sold to criminals. The revelation that Alex had profited from his abuse added another layer of violation to his crimes. He hadn't just been stealing my privacy and autonomy, he'd been selling my identity to fund his surveillance operation. The financial crimes carried additional federal charges that significantly increased his potential sentence. 6 months later, Alex was convicted on multiple federal and state charges, including felony stalking, computer fraud, identity theft, and harassment. He received a sentence of 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and mandatory counseling. The judge noted that Alex's systematic manipulation and manufactured emergencies represented a new level of sophistication in stalking behavior. The case became a landmark example of technology-facilitated abuse and led to new legislation requiring explicit consent for any location tracking between romantic partners. Technology companies were required to implement better safeguards against unauthorized surveillance software, and law enforcement received additional training on identifying digital stalking patterns. I testified at the sentencing hearing about the psychological impact of discovering that my entire relationship had been built on systematic deception and manufactured vulnerability. The violation went beyond privacy invasion. Alex had stolen my ability to trust my own instincts and judgment. He'd weaponized my gratitude and turned my capacity for love into a tool for his control. The emotional recovery took years of therapy and support from other survivors. I had to relearn how to trust my instincts and distinguish between genuine care and manipulative control. The experience taught me that real love asks for permission, respects boundaries, and doesn't require surveillance to maintain safety. The most disturbing aspect wasn't Alex's crimes, but how completely he'd convinced everyone around me that his behavior was evidence of exceptional love. The therapist who'd called me self-sabotaging, the sister who'd called me ungrateful, the friends who'd called me paranoid, they'd all been manipulated into supporting his abuse. Alex had created a perfect system where his victims defended his behavior and isolated themselves from potential help. The experience taught me to trust my instincts even when everyone else dismisses them. The red flag wasn't Alex's perfect timing. It was how that timing made me feel violated despite everyone insisting I should feel grateful. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who convince everyone, including their victims, that their harmful behavior is actually evidence of love and protection. Real love respects boundaries and asks for consent. Surveillance and manipulation are always signs of abuse, regardless of their justification or the support they receive from others.